Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses. Discovering the brilliance of Aquinas in his Catholic faith. This is day 46. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 89 and 90 of the Prima Pars, that is, the knowledge of the separated soul and the first production of man's soul. And the translation that I always use is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10. And so here we go. Article 1, whether the separated soul can understand anything. After death, are we able to go on thinking about things? St. Thomas responds, it is clear then that it is for the soul's good that it was united to a body, and that it understands by turning to the phantasms. Nevertheless, it is possible for it to exist apart from the body and also to understand in another way. A couple noteworthy insights to draw from this article. The first is that the soul continues to exist after separation from the body, as we have said previously, because the operation of intellect and will is not the act of a corporal organ, but an act of the intellectual soul only. The second is that it's a good thing for our soul to be united to the body and receive knowledge through the senses, since we are that bottom grade intellectual creature, which is not necessarily a bad thing, at least when it comes to the completeness of the universe. But this union with the body also allows our relatively weak intellects, compared to other creatures such as angels, to search out and grow in understanding over time through the consecutive inquiry into material things, which is helpful for us because, again, we're at that bottom rung of intellectual creatures. The third is that because we require recourse to the phantasms, or mental images, mental words, to actually consider or understand things, and since the imagination is a power of the body, as even other animals we see have, then when we lose the body, we are also, as a result, unable to understand in this particularly human way. However, since the light of the agent intellect is a light derived from God, when it comes to the understanding of the separated soul, Aquinas will not go so far as to call that way of understanding by God's assistance entirely unnatural, and it is possible. Here are his words. The separated soul, in that state, understands by means of participated species arising from the influence of the divine light, shared by the soul as by other separate substances, though in a lesser degree. Hence, as soon as it ceases to act by turning to corporal phantasms, the soul turns at once to the superior things. Nor is this way of knowledge unnatural, for God is the author of the influx of both of the light of grace and of the light of nature. Article 2, whether the separated soul understands separate substances. Separate substances means here other separated souls, people who have died, as well as those naturally existing in themselves immaterial things, such as angels. St. Thomas says, souls apart from the body know other separated souls, as we see in the case of the rich man in hell, who saw Lazarus and Abraham, that's Luke chapter 16, verse 23. Therefore, separated souls see the devils and the angels. But how are separated souls able to understand these separated substances? Through the assistance of God, in the words of Father Garrigou-Lagrange, the renowned 20th century commentator on Aquinas. Theologians commonly hold that the separated soul receives from God certain infused species, that's the intellectual forms in the mind, in the instant of separation to overcome this impediment. And St. Thomas writes, therefore the soul apart from the body has perfect knowledge of other separated souls, but it has an imperfect and defective knowledge of the angels so far as its natural knowledge is concerned. And the separated soul understands the angels by means of divinely impressed ideas, which, however, fail to give perfect knowledge of them, for as much as the nature of the soul is inferior to that of an angel. Article 3, whether the separated soul knows all natural things. Does a human being after death know the essence of all natural things like hydrogen, stones, dogs, angels, etc.? St. Thomas says, the separated soul, like the angels, understands by means of species received from the influence of the divine light. Nevertheless, as the soul by nature is inferior to an angel, to whom this kind of knowledge is natural, the soul apart from the body, through such species, does not receive perfect knowledge, but only a general and confused kind of knowledge. The case Aquinas is making in this article, in conjunction with the ones previous to it, is that it is fitting that God, who made the human intellect precisely to understand, would allow it to continue to understand even after the destruction of the body via these divinely impressed ideas. However, since the human intellect is made to understand through abstraction of material things, it does not understand these impressed ideas to the depth angels do, but in this general and confused kind of way. Article 4, whether the separated soul knows singulars. St. Thomas responds with Scripture. He writes, the rich man in hell said, I have 5 brethren. That's Luke chapter 16, verse 28. Does the separated soul know particular, singular things? That's the question. And the answer to this article is nuanced, so we will begin with Aquinas and then explain further. He writes, the angels, by reason of their perfect intellect, through these species, know not only the specific natures of things, but also the singulars contained in those species, whereas separated souls, by these species, know only those singulars to which they are determined by former knowledge in this life, or by some affection, or by natural aptitude, or by the disposition of the divine order. So the human mind understands, strictly speaking, the general essence, form, nature of things, and then by coordination with the internal and external senses, the imagination and the sense of sight, for example, the human person, which is a body-soul composite, can then understand particular individual material things. But when we lose the body, and with it both the interior and exterior senses, we can only understand singulars by having either some pre-existing relation to those singulars, or by being given knowledge of certain particular singulars according to God's will and from God himself. Article 5, whether the habit of knowledge acquired here remains in the separated soul. St. Jerome says, let us learn on earth that kind of knowledge which will remain with us in heaven. The habit of knowledge, which is what is referred to in this article, or the nature, species, forms of things which we have learned already and possess them, even when we are not actually thinking about them, does this habitual knowledge remain after death? And Aquinas says yes, and that because this is a quality or habit of the intellect, which is an immaterial faculty, not housed in a bodily organ, and therefore, insofar as the habit relates to the intellect, modifies the intellect, a quality of the intellect, just as the intellect remains after death, so too does this habit remain. In the words of St. Thomas, we must conclude that the habit of knowledge, so far as it is in the intellect, remains in the separated soul. Article 6, whether the act of knowledge acquired here remains in the separated soul. Aquinas responds to this article once more from Luke 16 and the dialogue between the rich man and Lazarus, where Abraham says, remember, thou didst receive good things in thy lifetime. St. Thomas says, the soul apart from the body can understand what it understood formerly, but in a different way, not by turning to the phantasms, but by a mode suited to a soul existing apart from the body. Thus, the act of knowledge here acquired remains in the separated soul, but in a different way. That different way means in a way not through recourse to the phantasm or imagination, but in that manner bestowed by the divine light, one not entirely dissimilar to for the way God enables the understanding of angels. Article 7, whether local distance impedes the knowledge in the separated soul. And this is kind of a curious question, and I wonder if Aquinas places it here simply for the sake of explaining this sentence from Luke 16, where the rich man, lifting up his eyes when he was in torment, saw Abraham afar off. Local distance is, in general, a nuanced topic along with place, and especially with regard to immaterial things like angels, which we covered at length in episodes 27 and 28, as well as here in regard to the separated soul. But for the purpose of this article, it will suffice to simply convey what St. Thomas conveys, which is this: the soul, when separated, understands singulars by species derived from the divine light, which is indifferent to what is near or distant. Hence, knowledge in the separated soul is not hindered by local distance. Article 8, whether separated souls know what takes place on earth. St. Thomas begins his response with a kind of summary of what we've said thus far on the knowledge of separated souls, in writing, by natural knowledge, of which we are treating now, the souls of the dead do not know what passes on earth, since the separated soul has knowledge of singulars by being in a way determined to them either by some vestige of previous knowledge or affection, or by the divine order. So, if separated souls know what is going on earth, then it is by the divine assistance, which St. Thomas articulates in these words: the souls of the blessed who see God do know all that passes here, for they are equal to the angels, of whom Augustine says that they know what happens among those living on earth. Souls in a separated state can know what is going on earth either by the impression of that information upon them by God, or by the knowledge which comes through the beatific vision, which we spoke of in episode 7. St. Thomas will also mention here that even if the souls in purgatory, for example, did not have specific knowledge of what is going on earth, they could still pray for the well-being of those who dwell on earth, in the same way that we pray for the well-being of the souls in purgatory, even though we don't know the specifics of the individual's conditions up there. And we move on to question 90 of the first production of man's soul. Article 1, whether the soul was made or was of God's substance. And with the latter just on its face, it's impossible, and we can almost feel St. Thomas's contempt of the question in his response, where he says, Augustine mentions certain opinions which he calls exceedingly and evidently perverse and contrary to the Catholic faith, among which the first is the opinion that God made the soul not out of nothing, but from himself. As we said in episode 24, God created everything out of nothing, not out of himself or his substance. From this point, Aquinas then refutes all the arguments contrary to his position, which are mostly from a materialistic or pantheistic notion of the world and God, which we definitively refuted with the first 11 questions of the Summa. In St. Thomas's words, the human soul is sometimes in a state of potentiality to the active intelligence, acquires its knowledge somehow from things, and thus has various powers, all of which are incompatible with the divine nature, which is a pure act, receives nothing from any other, and admits of no variety in itself, as we have proved. Article 2, whether the soul was produced by creation. Does our soul, which is the form of the body, need to be created ex nihilo, or out of nothing, by God? And it does, because our soul has faculties, namely the intellect and will, which exist independent of matter. And therefore, so too must exist the substance in which those faculties are housed, what we call the soul. The soul, then, not being something that is in matter potentially, like hydrogen, like the tree, like the dog, all of which are merely forms of matter or material forms existing potentially in matter, cannot be drawn out of matter. It must come from the outside. The human soul, an immaterial, existing in itself kind of thing, kind of like the angels, then cannot be created out of already existing matter, but must come out of nothing, even though the body, which the soul informs, does come from matter. St. Thomas puts it this way: the rational soul can be made only by creation, which, however, is not true of other forms, since it cannot be made of pre-existing matter, whether corporeal, which would render it a corporeal thing, or spiritual, which would involve the transmutation of one spiritual substance into another. We must conclude that it cannot exist except by creation. And the mention here of spiritual matter is kind of dubious and may refer to St. Thomas's inherited from the Greeks outdated cosmology, specifically the celestial spheres, which he mentions in this article, or he may be using it as a kind of analogy to mean the essence of a thing before receiving existence. But I will refer the listener to the text if they want to learn more on that. Article 3. Whether the rational soul is produced by God immediately. Does God create the human soul directly or through the action of another? St. Thomas gives a brief response to this article. It has been proved that the rational soul cannot be produced except by creation. Now, God alone can create, for the first agent alone can act without presupposing the existence of anything. Everything else acts by producing a change, whereas God alone acts by creation. Since, therefore, the rational soul cannot be produced by a change in matter, it cannot be produced, save immediately, by God. And for more on that, I would again recommend checking out episode 24. Article 4, whether the human soul was produced before the body. St. Thomas says, the soul as a part of human nature has its natural perfection only as united to the body. Therefore, it would have been unfitting for the soul to be created without the body. Form and matter in material things come into actual existence together because the nature, essence, form of dog doesn't actually exist in a mind-independent way until it informs some particular matter, the combination of which yields an actually existing particular dog. And then looked at from the other side, matter doesn't actually exist, doesn't come out of its state of pure raw potential existence until it is actually being informed by some form, essence, nature. Thus, since the soul is the form of the body, and granted in this case, since the soul is an immaterial existing in itself kind of thing, it could be produced before the body, it would be unfitting to do so because a human being is a body-soul composite. So it is fitting that at the moment of the soul's existence, in that same moment, it would also be informing the particular matter of its own particular and unique body. And with that, we have completed another day and 2 more questions of the Summa, that is, the knowledge of the separated soul and the first production of man's soul. And my name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.